welcome everyone to Gems from the Wisdom Traditions, a conversation circle offered every Saturday at Still and Moving Center. This year, we're taking up the theme of citizens of the future, and the theme for this week being self-determination seems very relevant to the future, where I don't think we can afford to be passive, that we can afford to be victims. I think we are going to have to be self-directing individuals. And we have someone who very much has exemplified that throughout his entire lifetime, in terms of what I know of him, and who also has a deep philosophical approach, something that he's studied and for decades, and that is the philosophy of Theosophy. He is the founder of Theosophy Trust, which is an online website that provides both written and then also online access to various philosophical and theosophical texts. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to John Powers. Thank you, John.
Thank you, Renee. I see you really don't know me that well if you think I've been self-determining my whole life, but we'll let that go. So self-determination, it's an idea that clearly has established itself in our culture at many levels, but tonight I'm going to be speaking about the subject as a philosophical stance from the Theosophical tradition. And my intention is to direct my comments especially to those who have a minimal familiarity with Theosophy, and to convey those teachings as clearly as possible. If I create some new confusion, my apologies, that's on me, but we'll sort that out later. The sources I've used are essays by Professor Raghavan Iyer, published in his 3-volume series, The Gupta Vidya. And those essays are Noetic Self-Determination, The Inmost Sanctuary, Spirit, Mind, and Matter, and Evolution and Consciousness, as well as other passages from theosophical literature. So the conventional understanding of the power of self-determination usually involves the image of someone who's taken the opportunities life presents to set in motion causes which will bear some desired fruit in the future. They might decide upon a course of action that will set them upon a certain career path, or perhaps they want to dedicate themselves to a certain ideal, or maybe they want to own their own business. But this is in marked contrast to the image of someone who more or less drifts along the currents and eddies of life, not knowing what particular direction to direct their efforts, or perhaps they don't see that they can actually make any meaningful efforts in any particular direction. They are frequently characterized by a kind of victim attitude, as though things only happen to them. They are never the instrumental cause of what comes to them. In our culture, we know the first image is the one that's most laudable. The self-made man is the epitome of that image, and he or she is held up to be the highest expression of the power of self-determination. Of course, as we all know, the self-made man is a fiction. Such persons owe too much to too many people who are conveniently left out of the picture of one's self-achievements. The power of self-determination can also be described as the knowledge of how to be an effective operator of karma. The person who can see opportunities and make use of them by setting in motion certain causes has an innate understanding of one of the ways karma operates in human lives to bring about desired results. But if there is an attachment, present to the results, karma also binds one to the effect of one's actions. This, of course, depends upon the motive for action. And the spiritual aspirant learns early on that one of the objectives of life is to gain a certain level of spiritual freedom, to become more and more free of the influence of desire in order to become a more effective helper to others. Hence, because of the binding effect of karma, the conventional understanding of the power of self-determination takes one in the wrong direction. Most students of Theosophy, I think, would immediately note that the key to this discussion lies in what we mean by the word self, as one of the key teachings in the Theosophical philosophy has to do with what is the true identity of a human being. Are we our bodies or minds? Are we our emotions, our name, our personal history, our background or upbringing? Is the unchanging identity we seek to be found in the earthly personality, the Mr. X or Miss Y that we know as a coworker or a friend or a neighbor? Or is there another dimension to each and every human being that is not evident, but is rather hidden in that unknown spiritual dimension deeply within and behind the persona? That hidden dimension is said to be the locus in Theosophy of the divine immortal element in man, the source of spiritual intuition, genius, and the reincarnating ego, altogether the real eternal self within every human being, as distinguished from the mortal and transitory or ever-changing personal self. So whatever self-determination might be, it hinges upon what self is determining what. But why does this matter? Well, this distinction is so important theosophically that H.P. Blavatsky, the teacher of Theosophy of the 19th century, wrote an entire article about it called Psychic and Noetic Action, in which she draws out the difference between the impulses that originate in our psychic nature and those that come to us from our noetic nature. She begins her argument by opposing all those reductionist and mechanistic views that would call the entire subjective realm of consciousness merely a collection of conditioned habitual responses over which the human being has, in the end, no control, that we are hopelessly and helplessly conditioned to respond in certain predictable ways so that there can be no such thing as free will. She notes that it is incumbent upon those she calls the occultist and theurgist to deny those theories and to point out that there are, in fact, many areas in human life where one can clearly observe the action of free will, those areas where one can make a vital difference to one's environment, one's future, and to our behavior patterns. In other words, our unique and not our predetermined response to life. Speaking of the distinction between the two kinds of mental action, HPB says in this article that mind is manas, or rather its lower reflection, which whenever it disconnects itself for the time being from kama, becomes the guide of the highest mental faculties and is the organ of the free will in physical man. From this, we might draw the corollary that our free will is illusory to the extent that it arises from an impulse to action that originates in the personal desire nature. In other words, action that is truly free is that for which the impulse is free of desire or the emotions and is rooted in the recognition and understanding of law or dharma. For the lower mind to exercise free will, it must dissociate itself to some extent from the influence of the desire principle and the emotions. As it does so, it increases its degree of a truly free will. So self-determination involves the will, as we all know from making New Year's resolutions that collapse in no long time after their formulation, especially when they involve losing weight. We know there is a will problem at work, but what is the solution? The personal will is notoriously variable like the moon. It waxes and wanes and often is not available when we call upon it. What we seek is a source of will without variability to inform our most important decisions, like taking a vow, charting a new course of self-correction, working towards some distant goal. That is, we're looking for a steady and constant influence that is itself rooted in that which does not wax and wane. So we're talking about more of a solar influence than a lunar influence, like that big sun behind Kim's head on the wall. So much is said in theosophical literature about this problem we are addressing, that of subjugating ourselves to the divine influence from within, rather than drifting through life under the dominant influence of the personal desire nature. In the Gupta Vidya, for example, in the essay entitled The Inmost Sanctuary, the very first paragraph begins with the following: restoration of the right relationship between the master in the inmost sanctuary and the incarnated consciousness is gained only through a sacrificial process of self-purification. Obscuring and polluting tendencies nurtured in the mind through its misuse over many lives must be removed by a self-chosen and self-administered therapy. The pristine divine ray of the Logos in man is trapped and stripped of its sovereign place in human life unless consciously sought by the aspirant. This invocation of wisdom through the supplication of the mind to the spirit was seen by the ancient Greeks as the cultivation of sophrosyne, the subordination of the inferior element to the superior. It is shown in the voice of the silence as the Shila virtue, the attunement of thought, will, and feeling to the pulsation of divine harmony, alaya, akasha. The mind stands as the critical link between the divine and the animal nature. The recovery and right use of the privilege of human existence depends upon the subordination of the elements of the lower rupa existence to the spiritual ideation of arupa manas. Thus, the awakening of the spiritual will begins not by focusing on something by that name, but rather by an individual assuming the proper mental posture towards the immortal part of his being. In other words, the lower self must willingly subordinate itself to the divine ego, its parent, its guiding star, and the real source of all the virtues the lower self might exhibit. The essential meaning of self-determination is that it does not happen automatically. It requires effort, it requires insight and initiative, it requires a sense of timing, and it especially requires an active will. Although the personal will may need to be strengthened, the higher spiritual will does not, as its tremendous energies can be released as obstructions to its action are removed. When released in a sustained manner, it effortlessly provides seemingly boundless energy and perseverance in the face of seemingly intractable obstacles. The biggest hindrance to the operation of the spiritual will occurs when the personal ego gravitates more toward the lower self than toward the spiritual self, when its motives are grounded in personal considerations rather than dedication to high ideals or the welfare of others. The Hermetics proposed that behind will stands desire. As long as the will operates on behalf of personal desires, it cannot draw upon the energies of the higher immortal nature. To function as the spiritual will rather than the personal will requires a pure motive, such as the desire to serve and help humanity, or at least those immediately around one. Thus, the will problem we have is actually one of limited personal desires, and the remedy is therefore to elevate our desire nature so that it becomes more universal and not personal in nature. In regard to all acts of creative will, an unselfish motive is crucial. Clearly, what is essential for that lunar self-determination to become a solar self-determination, one that is steadfast, unwavering, and resolute like the solar orb, has to do with the effort of the pilgrim soul to increase its connection to the silent spectator within, the immortal noetic individuality that incarnates from life to life during the entire cycle of necessity. Much light is shed upon this point in the essay Noetic Self-Determination in Gupta Vidya. Manas itself is the basis of the higher self-conscious will, which has no special organ, but is capable, independent of the brain and personality, of functioning on its own. This noetic individuality is distinct from the projected ray of lower manas, which is its organ, and distinct too from the physical brain and body, which are the organs of the psychic lower manas. This source of spiritual will is characterized in the Bhagavad Gita as the Kshetrajna, higher manas, the silent speaker, silent spectator, which is the voluntary sacrificial victim of all the mistakes and misperceptions of its projected ray. The contrast between the silent spectator and the despotic lower manas explains the difference between the psychic and the noetic. Wherever there is an assertion of the egotistic will, there is an exaggeration of the astral shadow and an intensification of kama manas. When the projected ray of manas becomes hard and cold, it tends to become parasitic upon others, taking without returning, claiming without thanking, continuously scheming without scruples. The test of whether one is becoming more truly a noetic individuality rather than becoming more passively subject to the psychic elements in one's nature is if one is reducing the sense of separateness between oneself and others. If one can enter into the reality of those we encounter and compassionately share their interests, their trials and successes, and especially the latter, can we genuinely celebrate the spiritual and moral triumphs of others without feeling threatened, jealous, or resentful that someone else has achieved something notable in their life? Are we becoming more nonviolent and less judgmental towards the people who may not agree with our own thinking? Are we less aggressive towards others and more desirous of establishing firm connections with them for the sake of our mutual welfare? As Professor Iyer says in this essay, the altruistic use of noetic wisdom, true theurgy, is the teaching of Gupta Vidya. The essay Noetic Self-Determination goes on to illuminate the life of spiritual freedom that the silent spectator enjoys when freed from the influence of the lower nature. The silent spectator is capable of thinking and ideating on its own. It is capable of disengaging altogether from lower manas, just as lower manas can disengage from kama, that is the desire principle. This skillful process of disengagement is similar to what Plato conveys through Socrates in Phaedo and also in the Apology. It is a process of consciously dying, which the philosopher practices every moment, every day. By dying unto this world, one can increasingly disengage from the will to live, the tanha of the astral and physical body. It is possible by conscious spiritual exercises for the individual progressively to free higher manas from its lower manasic limitations, projections, excuses, evasions, and habits. Besides these metapsychological truths that create a strong inner impulse towards the higher spiritual elements in our nature, there's also another, and what we might call metahistorical reason why noetic self-determination is so important to the human pilgrimage at this point of human history. And it lies in the radical changes that have taken place and are now taking place in the impulse that drives human evolution. The Theosophical conception of evolution describes that process as both an involution and an evolution. First, a period of immense magnitude in which spirit descends into or becomes involved in matter, and a second corresponding arc in which spirit ascends out of matter and back towards a state of oneness with the source of all life, light, consciousness, forms, and energy. Thus, Theosophy adds to the scientific conceptions of material evolution that of an internal evolution in consciousness, leading to self-consciousness and eventually universal self-consciousness. If we term this evolution of consciousness spiritual evolution, we might say that during the first half of the evolutionary cycle, the involutionary arc of descent of spirit into matter, the one spirit becomes the many different beings and life forms in our world. But if there is an involution of spirit into matter, there must also be an evolution of spirit out of matter. And this is what happens in the second half of the great evolutionary period, as spirit carries with it all beings in a conscious return to the source from which all arose at the beginning. A crucial effect of this transition of the action of spirit after the midpoint of evolution, when the many begins its journey to re-become the one, is a corresponding change in the impulse that drives human evolution. Whereas during the first half of this period, human souls were carried along by the evolutionary force and the development of all the life forms on Earth. But during the second half of the process, that of spirit freeing itself from confinement in the gross matter, human beings will have to take an increasingly active and deliberately conscious role in their ascent out of matter. No longer will humans be able to be just carried along without effort. We now have to learn how to be active participants in the evolutionary task. One of the essential aspects of this conscious, deliberate task is the development of spiritual self-determination, which involves self-regeneration and ultimately the complete renunciation of the personal self. This process of self-regeneration, focusing upon the purification and perfection of the vestures of the spiritual aspirant, accompanies the unfoldment of the mysteries of human evolution. As human beings prepare themselves for the discipleship of learning how to help the entire human race, we learn to choose a mode of living which enhances the work of developing and maintaining noetic self-determination. As Professor Iyer further notes, each human being every day and night has microcosmic choices and opportunities, which, if calmly understood from the perspective of the macrocosmic, enables an honest seeker to be truly helpful to the brotherhood of bodhisattvas. In the early stages, this would be mostly unconscious to the lower mind, but entirely clear to the immortal soul. Even small differences wrought in the moral choices one makes by night and day can unlock doors for vast numbers of human beings and open pathways which will be relevant to the races to come and the Aquarian civilization of the future. Aspiring disciples will find that sometimes just by taking a phrase or a sentence and writing it out, reflecting upon it and sincerely attempting to apply it to themselves, trying to use it at dawn, midday, the twilight hour, or late at night, but always so that one may become the better able to help and serve the whole of the human race. They will tap the inexhaustible resources of Akasha, or the storehouse, the universal storehouse of wisdom in the universe. Thus, true self-determination is equivalent to the voluntary cooperation with the necessities of the universe, not kicking against that in life which one cannot change. We cannot opt out of the universal pilgrimage which we embarked upon millions of years ago. We did not choose, in the usual sense of the term, to incarnate into this life, having the parents and siblings and other family we have. And we cannot choose to not incarnate again into other families in the future. We cannot choose to not breathe the air around us, as we cannot choose to not eat food to stay alive. There are vastly more aspects to life in which we have no real choice whether to go along with the necessities of the universe. We simply must accept those necessities, and then we can choose to cooperate with life in all of its manifold manifestations. We can choose to cooperate with the operation of karma. We can choose to become valuable members of the human race. The highest form of self-determination, then, is that of the man or woman who self-consciously chooses the path of self-regeneration in the service of others, and learns over lifetime skillful means by the use of which he may become one of that largely invisible tribe of the benefactors of humanity. We will close with the following statement from The Voice of the Silence, as it embodies some important lessons for us on the power of self-determination. Prepare and be forewarned in time. If thou hast tried and failed, O dauntless fighter, yet lose not courage. Fight on, and to the charge return again and yet again. The fearless warrior, his precious lifeblood oozing from his wide and gaping wounds, will still attack the foe, drive him from out his stronghold, vanquish him ere he himself expires. Act then, all ye who fail and suffer, act like him, and from the stronghold of your soul, chase all your foes away. Ambition, anger, hatred, into the shadow of desire, when even you have failed. Remember, thou that fightest for man's liberation, each failure is success, and each sincere attempt wins its reward in time. The holy germs that sprout and grow unseen in the disciple's soul, their stalks wax strong at each new trial. They bend like reeds, but never break, nor can they e'er be lost. But when the hour has struck, they blossom forth. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John. Very well considered essay. You know, as I was listening to it, one of the dominant themes that I heard is that you are distinguishing between spiritual self-determination and ordinary, everyday sort of self-determination that a lot of us might think of in terms of somebody who's ambitious and sets a goal and pursues it and gets there. And what I'm hearing from you, it seems like to me, and I'm wondering what other people might have to say, is it sounds as if we're not actually as free as we think we are, perhaps. when we've got that selfish motive, that personal ambition that's driving what we feel like or think of as being self-determining agents. If it's selfishly driven in some way, I think you're saying we're actually not free. So we aren't actually choosing our course in some way. David?
I think that goes back to where he began the topic with first defining who we are, who the self is, with a capital S or a small s. And the self-determination that he's speaking about is the higher self, you might say. Mm-hmm. John, would you agree that that was the distinction?
Yes, absolutely. Renee, you were exactly right. That's precisely one of the points that I was making in the talk, that the conventional understanding of self-determination of someone who has very strong desires and, engages the personal will and, accomplishes some worldly goal that they've set themselves towards, is laudable in most people's minds. And I'm not saying it isn't laudable. What I was trying to point out was that for the spiritual aspirant who is after something very different, he or she is looking to eliminate the binding effect of karma that comes about through attachment to the results of action. So the first example, the person who in the conventional understanding of self-determination is, has this intense desire and will and go get 'em attitude to accomplish something, is binding themselves further to the results of the actions which they have set in motion, and they guarantee a return back to the earth plane for another round of learning that this is not what life should be all about. It should be, all life is sacrifice. All life is service and sacrifice. That was Gandhi's message. That was Christ's message. That was Buddha's message. That's the message of all the teachers. So until we learn that, we have to keep coming back over and over again to get the idea. And
so that's not free.
no, you're not free at all. That was the point that's the point that Spinoza made, that human beings are not free when they think they are exercising free will, because their will is being constrained by something that is outside of their real nature, which is their desire nature. So as David pointed out about the large S self, well, that desire nature is actually external to that real S self. It doesn't have it's not, the lower desire nature is not part of that larger S self's nature, put it that way. There's the mortal and there's the immortal, and never the twain shall meet, as they say.
Or hopefully actually they do, and it'd be like Plato, who's got the wild black horse and the white horse that's pretty tame and well behaved, and he somehow is able, the charioteer is able to use the power of that powerful dark horse to actually help reach the goal. So hopefully there is some transmutation of that lower. But Diana, I saw your hand up.
Yeah, I really appreciated your talk. It was really interesting. And what came to me was that self-determination is my choice to live spiritual will versus personal will. And to do that, it has to be a conscious choice. And in that conscious choice, it takes self-understanding, it takes effort, for me, it takes a spiritual practice to listen and to be guided. And it's a way of feeling and really making that consciously, that you want to be a citizen of the future that is less judgmental, that has the best for everyone, and to be of service to others and have a connection to others for the benefit of all human beings. And I think that becomes a practice. We have to look at our wounded stories that are driving us in our karma. And I think that the essential part for me is really having some way that we can connect to that higher self or divine wisdom, and to really take the time and effort to put in so that we can listen to that versus our personal will. And it doesn't mean we don't have that, but that I make a conscious choice to live that. And I hadn't thought of it before, that self-determination is the choice to will. My choice is to live the spiritual will instead of my personal will. Thank
Yeah,
you.
thank you. Sarah Hodges, you have some thoughts you want to add in here?
Yeah, there's a few that are formulating. Yeah, and something about, are we able to separate, or is there some like middle area where our individual will is blending into our spiritual will? And if we have nothing of acquiring of the individual, do we have so much to give? And I know in my own understanding, yes, of course, there's a endless well to give from in the spiritual self, but I just wonder, for the Western perspective that is so much about attaining, and then you have something to give. If I don't know if I'm making sense, but is there something someone would want to say on that note of how to make a bridge with the very Western way of attaining stuff in order to be able to do things to provide, to be of service?
Sarah, what if one were to take stock very impartially of all the various gifts and strengths that one has to be of service to the world? And somehow, and those are unique and individual to us. There's attributes that we have cultivated over who knows how long, right? And if we were to be able to somehow channel all those into a service offering, would that be some way of kind of doing this merging that you're talking about? Am I
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I think that's exactly, I guess, what it comes to, of how we refine the energy that we've been individually given, to really tap into the larger, that energy even is beyond just our capsule, I believe, but to tap into something that can come through it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Still formulating that thought, but that does touch on it.
Tell me if this is off base. If you could share with us the really profoundly powerful experience that you had playing the role of the goddess Pele just a couple weeks ago, which was so moving to those of us who were in the audience. And you even had your auntie come to the show with a lei for you that you intended to put on you after the show, but she left because she didn't think you were in the show. She thought that you had a stand-in for you. She didn't even recognize you, in other words. So there was something of the impersonal flowing through. I mean, you cleared yourself out of the way, it seemed like to me, for this very powerful energy, pure, to come onto the stage for the rest of us, right? And you had to use a lot of skills that Sarah Hodges had cultivated over your lifetime, and who knows from how long before. Can you talk about that a little bit? Is that a relevant question for me to ask?
Maybe, I don't know. Everyone can decide if it sounds relevant, but it did feel like a very concrete, visceral experience of clearing the individual self. Even though it was a solo, what you would maybe think of as something individual, it was extremely not in my experience of it. And it felt like one of the most pure sharings of life force. That from the feedback that I received, probably not from every single person, but enough people, it had some kind of profound impact on, and myself as well, that somehow sharing the unique way that life force comes through us in complete purity, that maybe the formulated self doesn't get in the way at all, that it's hugely impactful, and maybe it reminds us of something, or it really just feels like truly what the energy of life, the capacity of it is just so magnificent and huge. And if we were to walk through the world sharing that, I wonder what that would look like, to really walk through as a vessel to fully share this unadulterated life force in every single step that we walk through life. It's kind of a thought I've been looking at.
And I think you felt as if there was some beneficence in sharing that. It wasn't just any life force. You felt as if it were a beneficent act for you to be sharing that with the world. That was my experience, right?
Yeah, it was very humbling. It's hard to put words to it, but yeah, it felt like my heart bowing deeper than the earth to this much more powerful force that exists in everything.
Thank you so much. I think I saw Cliff's hand up.
Well, yeah, there's a few thoughts here. John, that you covered a whole lot of ground there. It was really an amazing presentation, and I don't think any of us can assimilate everything that you gave us. One of the thoughts that came to my mind was just that quote by Chardin, that we're spiritual beings having a human experience. And that your whole the ideas you were sharing about involution and evolution, involution of spirit into matter and evolution of spirit out of matter, I think is one of the critical teachings of theosophy. You know, involution can kind of be connected with creation, and then evolution, Darwin just kind of materializes it, but real evolution has to do with the complexity of form to further allow the rising up of spirit and the release of spirit. But the idea of the involution having to do with necessity, but evolution having to do with self-determination, that at some point self-determination has to kick in, and for that motor power to do that ascending arc. And I'm thinking of that quote that's the self-governed sage in the second chapter of the Bhagavad Gita. At the very beginning of the self-governed sage, the first sentence is, a man is said to be confirmed in spiritual knowledge when he forsaketh every desire which enters the heart. I always found that one sentence so intriguing, the idea of desires entering the heart versus the implication that there might be desires that can be generated in the heart. So there might be two forms of desire: the desire to get things outside of ourselves, but this other way of desiring that we actually generate inside of ourselves. And that might have something to do with regeneration. But I think also in Sarah's experience, it was such a pure desire to share and to give the depth of Pele, that it was just this radical experience for everybody that was in the audience, but also you impersonally, because the desire was generated in your heart versus a desire to get anything from your performance. But I was wondering if anybody, and you too, John, especially, had any thoughts on how we could distinguish between a desire that would have to do with self-determination in the deeper spiritual sense that we can generate versus the other forms of desires that we always are dealing with. How can we distinguish between those two different forms of desire?
Yeah, I'll let the guests here have a shot at that first, and then I'll say something about it, Cliff.
There was this quote, and I'm not sure who had said this recently, but something about choice, and when you're making a choice or thinking of something, if it doesn't have this potential to affect the ones with the least or the most impoverished and that sort of thing. It reminded me, I don't know if that really is an answer to it, but it reminded me of that quote of how far reaching is this desire. Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah, I think that what you said was exactly right, Sarah. My recollection is Gandhi said something very much like that. He said, before you undertake any action, ask yourself whether what you propose to do would have any benefit for the least and the poorest human being you know of on the earth. Would it benefit that person in any way? And if it would, then you know your answer of, whether your action is correct. And if it wouldn't benefit that person, then you need to rethink what you plan on doing. So there are tests. We can devise tests to test our motives, to test our desires, whether we, notice our thoughts, to look carefully at our thoughts that accompany a desire to do a particular thing, and see, is there any, does the idea of personal recognition come into your head? Does do you think about what you might gain from it? What would other people think of you in your doing this action? So there are a number of things that we can do by careful, ethical, doing our ethical homework. And that's how we distinguish, because we have the ability to know thyself, and we have the powers of mind to be able to discriminate, and we're not bound to be ceaselessly self-deceived. We can break through deception, self-deception. We can perceive the truth about ourselves, but we have sometimes a lot of cobwebs to dig through before we get to that clarified perception, which allows us to, to see the truth about such matters.
Mary, do you want to weigh in on this at all? Or something else in regard to this idea of self-determination?
I just think that I've got a lot of work to do. As old as I am, I'm still learning, I'm still reevaluating. That's just one of those things. Thank you.
And how do you tell whether a desire that you have is more selfish or unselfish? What's your kind of?
I agree. If it's, if it's harmful to somebody else, is it for the better good?
Ah.
That's the ultimate test. That's the ultimate answer. If it's going to benefit or if it's going to hurt.
Yes. Beautiful. Thank you. David.
I was going to second what Cliff said. John's talks are often like trail mix, right? They're just high-powered, really densely packed bits of nuggets of delicious nutrient. And I was thinking about 5 minutes in, like, John, you need to pause because we could fill the hour with that first 5 minutes of your talk. And that we might, when you offer up again, we may have to divide you into segments, so that because the thoughts were flowing and the notes were making, and I did bristle initially in your description of two different paths, one where people are determined and going down a path of choice versus those that wander aimlessly. And for myself, I identify with one who flows through life. But I think there's this what I call the third path, which is that I trust inherently in the flow of life itself, that the universe is flowing and it's flowing on our behalf. And I don't need to be grasping at this and that desire, because what is necessary for me or best for me will be offered up. And if I'm paying attention, I will flow in that direction. And then I think you proceeded to take the conversation in that direction when you made the distinction of the various forms of self, that my trust in the universe is that trust in the higher aspect of myself. That's kind of where I went with that. But on the topic, I thought it was beautiful when you were talking about involution and evolution, because it reminds me of our development as a human being. You know, we come into this life and we're completely helpless, and things are just given and given and given to us in our early stages. But then as we get to the stage where most of us in this meeting are at in our life, it's time to give back. It's that evolution time. And that was that our life is a microcosm of that evolution process that you're referring to. And I had a zillion other thoughts, but I see we're closing on the hour, so I'll turn it back to you.
Can we open it to someone who hasn't had a chance to speak yet?
There was a part of your talk, John, where you were talking about willpower. As I understood you, first you were speaking of lower will, and then you spoke of spiritual will. But something you said, I wanted clarification on. It sounded like there actually is a role for the lower will, that it is something about you have to pay attention to it and transmute it, because spiritual will doesn't need any release or any enhancement. It's always a strong force. Do you remember some?
Yes, exactly. No, I'm happy you picked up on that point. Yeah, there is a role certainly for the lower will, as there is for the lower desires as well, because we're engaged in, as theosophically, as sevenfold human beings. We're complex creatures, and we have a variety of these instruments and principles that been bequeathed to us by other beings. And the will is something that it all flows from the Atman event, ultimately, whether it's the spiritual will acting at a higher plane or the personal will acting in the lower planes. So the origin of the will, Mr. Judge describes it, Mr. Judge being one of the teachers of Theosophy in the 19th century, describes it as a pure, colorless force that takes its coloration from the desire that directs it. So when it's acting on the lower planes towards, sort of earthly objectives, like getting a job or, buying a new car or whatever it is, some physical thing, it can also be purified, that it doesn't have to be polluted with selfishness. It can be, one has to have a place to live, one has to have clothing, one has to have all the, the material accoutrements of life. but it's why do you want those things? What use do you put them to? What's the motive behind it? If it's so that you can be part of human society and do what you need to do, then, that's the proper role for, the lower will. It enables you to do those things. But what we're talking about with the higher will, the spiritual will, is that it's on its own plane. It's virtually, how would you put it? Not omniscient, but sort of, it has no restrictions on its power. It can create as easily as it can destroy. So we're told that the secrets, so to speak, about the unleashing of the spiritual will are not given out to the public. They're held back because if people knew how to engage the spiritual will, that great harm would result. And it's something that one might naturally develop and experience, but it's not something that one seeks to release. As I mentioned in the talk, it comes about through the subjugation of the lower self, the willing subjugation of the lower self to the divine self within. And the spiritual will arise and will play its part naturally, in the same way that when you walk, your balance and how you use your arms and your legs develops naturally. But it's not something that one should try to hurry the development of, because it's like the Shaktis and the Siddhis. Awakening those powers before one is morally prepared to use it is a sure path to destruction. And we want to use all of our gifts and all of our powers for beneficent purposes. And so anyway, that's all I have to say. Sorry, I went on a little bit too long.
No, that's fine. I'm seeing Maurice's hand, and in addition to whatever else you might say, Maurice, can I ask you to also give our wonderful speaker for today a vote of thanks included in what you are going to say?
Yes, I would be glad to. I just wanted to say that so we don't get the impression there's some kind of dual mind or dual reality, higher, lower. That maybe, and I think John alluded to this with mental posture. It's more a question of kind of where we put our awareness or our mental posture. So when we do the mundane things in life that we have to do, including get a job and all those things like that, I think there's a way that we can do it, which to the extent possible, we can become more cooperative, more pleasant, more cheerful, raise the social atmosphere, even when we're doing jobs that are difficult, or the test, of course, is when we get into a little difficult situations. That's the test. So yes, there's higher and lower, but the whole idea is to the extent to which, and you have to practice this, as John pointed out, you could stay in a more higher, compassionate attitude and detach yourself from your attachment to your desires. You could still pursue desires that are very legitimate in that way. So that's really the challenge, is through our speech and through our action, through loving kindness, still achieve what the lower mind needs to achieve, so to speak, or how to get along in the world. So, and so anyway, John, you've really given us, you've really shined a light on all of us, and sometimes it gets pretty bright, but and we need a little shade, but it was just really in 30, I clocked you actually in 35 minutes to give such a well-rounded presentation. And whatever the details were, you did hit our hearts. And I just want to thank you on behalf of myself, and I'm sure all of us, that you've not only widened our minds, but you really hit our hearts. And thank you all for your comments, which really expanded our hearts, I think, and our minds. So, John, thank you so much.
Yes, thank you so much, John, indeed. Our topic next week, when this one had so much to do with how we direct our consciousness, our mind. We talked about this idea of manas, which does mean mind in Sanskrit. For next week, we're very deliberately going to the heart with the joy of devotion. So I think it will be a really beautiful balance between the 2 weeks. If you'd like to stay on for, I think it's about 2.5 minutes, I'm going to show a video clip of Sarah's performance of this Hawaiian goddess of Pele. So wish me luck with the technology of doing this.
Great.
No mea ela kawahine kapu.
There we go.
I have a question. How did you move so smoothly? I mean, were you on roller skates? How did you do that?
Exactly my thoughts.
Renee
Were you
asked the
actually
same thing.
walking?
No idea. I didn't know it looked that smooth, but that's nice that it did.
It was magnificent. Wow. Thank you.
Who was the narrator?
Star, that's her name, Star.
Star. Okay.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you.
You were the dance, you were the costume too.
Yeah.
That was an amazing costume. Wow.
That was stunning.
Stunning. Yeah. Thank you.
It touched everyone's heart. It was just amazing that you weren't there. You were being guided through. It was like you could really feel that you weren't doing it. Yeah.
It's incredible to feel that in such a visceral way of being guided.
Yeah. Thank you.
can
That was
certainly
beautiful.
get the feeling that all matter is alive. Thank you.
Mm.
Thank you, John.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you, John.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you for your attendance. It's wonderful to have each of you, and especially John. Thank you so much.